The security checkpoint at Naval Base San Diego buzzed with its usual morning activity when Sarah Chen stepped through the metal detector. Her worn jeans and simple black t-shirt made her look like any other civilian visitor, but something about her posture caught the attention of Petty Officer Martinez. She moved with a precision that seemed almost military, her eyes scanning the area with practiced awareness. "Ma'am, I need to see your identification and visitor's pass," Martinez said, extending his hand. Sarah reached into her back pocket and produced a California driver's license. Martinez glanced at it, then looked up at her face, noting the small scar that ran from her left temple to her jawline. "Purpose of your visit today?" "Meeting with Captain Reynolds about a consulting opportunity," she replied, her voice steady and confident. Martinez nodded and was about to wave her through when he noticed something that made him pause. As Sarah adjusted her t-shirt, he caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a tattoo on her upper arm. It was partially hidden by her sleeve, but he could make out what looked like military insignia. "Ma'am, can I see your arm for a moment?" Martinez asked, his tone becoming more formal. Sarah's expression didn't change, but she seemed to tense slightly. "Is there a problem, Petty Officer?" "Just routine, ma'am." "Please roll up your sleeve." Reluctantly, Sarah pulled up her left sleeve, revealing a detailed tattoo that made Martinez's eyes widen. The design showed the distinctive Navy SEAL trident, complete with the eagle, anchor, trident, and pistol that marked the elite special operations community. Below it were what appeared to be mission dates and coordinates. Martinez felt his blood pressure rise. He had seen plenty of wannabes try to pass themselves off as SEALs, and it always made him angry. The idea that some civilian would permanently ink herself with sacred military symbols was beyond insulting. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside," he said, his voice now cold and official. "What's the problem?" Sarah asked, though her calm demeanor suggested she had been through this before. "The problem is the tattoo on your arm. You're impersonating military personnel, specifically Navy SEALs. That's a federal crime." Sarah sighed deeply. "Petty Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding, ma'am. I know stolen valor when I see it. Please step into the holding area while I call the MPs." The next 30 minutes were uncomfortable for everyone involved. Sarah sat quietly in the small holding room while Martinez filled out paperwork and made phone calls. Word of the incident spread quickly through the base, and soon a small crowd of personnel had gathered outside the security office. "Can you believe it?" whispered Seaman Johnson to his partner. "A woman claiming to be a SEAL? That's just disrespectful." "I heard she's got the whole trident tattooed on her arm," replied Petty Officer Davis. "These stolen valor cases are getting more bold every day." Inside the holding room, Sarah remained calm, occasionally checking her watch. She had been through variations of this situation before, though usually it was resolved much more quickly. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was being detained on a base where she had once been stationed, by people who had no idea who she really was. Military Police Sergeant Rodriguez arrived within 20 minutes, looking serious and professional as he reviewed the paperwork Martinez had prepared. He was a veteran himself, having served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and he took stolen valor cases personally. "Miss Chen, I'm Sergeant Rodriguez. I understand you've been detained for impersonating military personnel. Specifically, for having unauthorized military tattoos and potentially claiming to be a Navy SEAL." "I haven't claimed to be anything," Sarah replied calmly. "I was simply trying to enter the base for a legitimate meeting." "But, you do have the SEAL trident tattooed on your arm," Rodriguez stated, making it clear he had seen the evidence. "I do. Can you explain why a civilian would have that particular tattoo?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh her options. Finally, she spoke. "Sergeant, I understand your concern, and I respect what you're trying to do. Stolen valor is a serious issue, and you're right to investigate. But I think there may be more to this situation than meets the eye." "Ma'am, with respect, that's what everyone says when they get caught. The fact is, you have military insignia permanently marked on your body, and you're not currently in uniform or able to produce military identification." "In my experience, that usually means one thing." Rodriguez was thorough in his questioning, asking about Sarah's background, her connection to the military, and why she was on base. Sarah answered his questions honestly but without offering more information than asked for. She mentioned that she had a security clearance and had worked with various military units in the past, but she didn't elaborate on the specifics. "You say you've worked with military units," Rodriguez pressed. "In what capacity?" "Consulting and training," Sarah replied. "I have experience in tactical operations and have provided instruction to various special operations groups." This answer only made Rodriguez more suspicious. In his experience, most military contractors were either former military themselves or had extensive documentation of their work. Sarah seemed reluctant to provide either. The situation began to escalate when Rodriguez decided to call in additional personnel. He contacted the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, explaining that he had a potential stolen valor case that might require federal charges. The mention of NCIS brought more attention to the situation, and soon the small holding room felt like the center of a much larger investigation. Captain Martinez, the base security chief, arrived to personally review the case. He was known for running a tight ship and had zero tolerance for anyone who dishonored the uniform. When he saw the detailed seal trident on Sarah's arm, his expression hardened. "This is absolutely unacceptable," he said to Rodriguez. "I want her processed to the full extent of the law. The SEAL community has enough problems without civilians parading around with their symbols." Sarah listened to the conversation without comment, but those watching noticed that she didn't seem particularly worried about the threats of federal charges. If anything, she appeared to be growing slightly impatient, as if this were an inconvenience rather than a crisis. "Ma'am," Captain Martinez addressed her directly, "do you understand the seriousness of what you've done? Impersonating military personnel is a federal crime. Having that tattoo is a desecration of everything the SEAL teams stand for." "Captain, I understand your position," Sarah replied carefully. "And I respect your dedication to protecting the honor of the military. But I think you should verify a few things before proceeding with any charges." "What kind of things?" "I think you should check with Captain Reynolds, who I was supposed to meet with today. I also think you might want to run my name through the appropriate databases before making any assumptions about my background." Captain Martinez was about to respond when a new voice entered the conversation. "What's all the commotion out here?" Everyone turned to see Admiral James Morrison approaching the security office. At 62, Morrison was a decorated veteran who commanded respect throughout the naval community. He had served in multiple combat zones and had personally led several high-profile special operations missions during his career. "Admiral," Captain Martinez snapped to attention. "We have a stolen valor situation. Civilian woman with unauthorized SEAL insignia." Admiral Morrison's expression grew stern. Stolen valor was something he took extremely seriously, having served alongside many of the men and women who had earned the right to wear the trident. "Let me see this individual." Rodriguez escorted Sarah out of the holding room and into the main security area where Admiral Morrison waited. The Admiral looked her up and down, taking in her civilian clothes and calm demeanor. His eyes fixed on the tattoo that was still visible on her exposed arm. For a long moment, Admiral Morrison studied the intricate design. The trident was expertly done, with precise detail that showed real knowledge of the insignia. Below it, he could see what appeared to be coordinates and dates, the kind of specific information that suggested actual operational experience. Something about the tattoo made Morrison pause. He had seen many SEAL tridents over the years, both real and fake, and there was something about this one that seemed different. The coordinates looked familiar, and the dates rang a bell in his memory. As he looked more closely, Admiral Morrison's expression began to change. Recognition dawned slowly, and his eyes widened as he focused on one particular set of numbers tattooed beneath the trident. The coordinates were 31.5497 degrees north, 74.3436 degrees east. Morrison knew those coordinates by heart. They marked a location in Pakistan where one of the most classified operations in recent military history had taken place. An operation so secret that even most military personnel didn't know it had happened. An operation where he had served as the commanding officer and had personally selected every member of the team. His eyes moved to the date beneath the coordinates, August 15, 2018. Admiral Morrison felt his heart rate increase as memories flooded back. August 15, 2018. The night his team had successfully extracted 3 American hostages from a Taliban compound. The night one of his operators had been severely wounded but had continued fighting to ensure the mission's success. The night he had personally recommended someone for the Navy Cross, the service's second highest decoration for valor. Looking at Sarah's face more carefully, Morrison began to see past the civilian clothes and longer hair. The scar on her face wasn't from some random accident, it was from shrapnel she had taken during that extraction mission. Her calm demeanor in this stressful situation wasn't arrogance or defiance, it was the confidence of someone who had been through far worse. The Admiral's voice was barely a whisper as recognition fully dawned. "That tattoo is genuine." The silence that followed Admiral Morrison's whispered words was deafening. Every person in the security office froze, unsure of what they had just heard or what it meant. Captain Martinez felt his confidence wavering as he watched the Admiral's expression transform from stern disapproval to something approaching awe. "Admiral?" Rodriguez ventured cautiously, "Did you say the tattoo is genuine?" Morrison didn't answer immediately. He was still studying Sarah's face, memories cascading through his mind like scenes from a half-remembered dream. The woman standing before him looked different from the operator he remembered, softer somehow, her hair longer, her face less angular than it had been under the tactical gear and camouflage paint. But the eyes were the same. Those calm, intelligent eyes that had looked back at him through the chaos of that Pakistani compound, even as blood ran down her face from the shrapnel wound. "Petty Officer Martinez," Morrison said slowly, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the room stand straighter. "Please clear this area of all non-essential personnel. Captain Martinez, Sergeant Rodriguez, you stay. Everyone else out, now." The gathered crowd of curious onlookers reluctantly dispersed, sensing that something significant was happening but not understanding what. When the security office was clear except for the essential personnel, Admiral Morrison turned his full attention to Sarah. "Lieutenant Commander Chen," he said formally, using a rank that made the remaining officers exchange confused glances. "It's been a long time." Sarah straightened slightly, and, for the first time since her detention began, she smiled. "Good to see you again, Admiral. Though I was hoping our reunion would be under better circumstances." Captain Martinez felt his world spinning. "Admiral, I don't understand. Lieutenant Commander? She's not in uniform, and she didn't present military identification." Morrison's expression hardened as he turned to face the captain. "That's because Lieutenant Commander Chen is no longer on active duty. She was medically retired from the Navy 3 years ago after sustaining serious injuries during a classified operation. An operation where she saved the lives of 3 American hostages and half her team, including myself." The words hit the room like a physical force. Sergeant Rodriguez felt his stomach drop as he realized the magnitude of the mistake they had made. They hadn't just detained a civilian with stolen valor, they had essentially arrested a decorated war hero. "But, Admiral," Rodriguez said weakly, "she never said she was military. She let us assume she was impersonating a SEAL." Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "Sergeant, I learned a long time ago that explaining my background to people who have already made up their minds is usually a waste of time. I found it's better to let the facts speak for themselves when the right people show up." Morrison nodded, understanding. He knew the challenges that special operations veterans faced when transitioning to civilian life, especially those whose service records were classified. Sarah couldn't simply pull out her DD-214 and prove her military service because most of her missions were still sealed under national security provisions. "Admiral," Captain Martinez said, his voice reflecting his embarrassment, "I had no idea." "If she's a veteran, why didn't she just say so?" "Because, Captain," Morrison replied, "some veterans prefer not to advertise their service, especially when that service involved operations that officially never happened. And, frankly, she shouldn't have to justify her tattoos to anyone." The Admiral moved closer to examine Sarah's tattoo more carefully, and the others could see him pointing to specific elements of the design. "These coordinates," he said, his voice filled with respect, "mark the location where Lieutenant Commander Chen led an assault team into a Taliban compound to extract 3 American contractors who had been held hostage for 8 months. The date commemorates the night she took shrapnel to the face and a bullet through her shoulder, but still managed to carry one of the hostages to the extraction point when he was too weak to move on his own." Morrison turned to face the assembled officers, his expression serious. "Gentlemen, you're looking at one of the finest naval officers I've ever had the privilege to serve with. Lieutenant Commander Chen was hand-picked for the most elite special operations unit in the Navy. She completed 3 combat tours, participated in 17 classified missions, and earned more decorations than most officers see in a 20-year career." Sarah shifted uncomfortably at the praise. "Admiral, you don't need to explain my service record. These officers were doing their job, protecting the base from people who dishonor the uniform.
I understand their reaction.
No, Morrison said firmly.
What happened here today should not have happened.
And it illustrates a larger problem we have in how we treat our veterans, especially those whose service was in the shadows. Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment. Ma'am, I owe you a sincere apology. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and I treated you with disrespect.
There's no excuse for that.
Sergeant, Sarah replied kindly, you were protecting something you believe in.
That's admirable, not wrong.
The problem is that there are people who do steal valor, and your vigilance is necessary to protect the honor of those who actually earned it.
Captain Martinez was struggling to process what he was hearing. Lieutenant Commander, why didn't you correct us earlier?
You could have avoided this entire situation by simply explaining who you were. Sarah was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully.
Captain, I've learned that my word alone often isn't enough. People see a woman with a seal tattoo, and they assume I'm either lying or that I somehow didn't earn it the same way the men did.
I've been through variations of this conversation before, and I've found that it's often better to let the facts emerge naturally than to try to convince skeptical people of something they're not ready to believe. Her words hung in the air, carrying a weight of experience that none of the men could fully understand.
Admiral Morrison nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in her statement. Unfortunately, Morrison said, Lieutenant Commander Chen is right.
There's still a bias in how we view women in special operations, even when they've proven themselves beyond any doubt. Chen wasn't just a member of the team, she was one of our best operators. Her tactical skills and operational intelligence were exceptional. Morrison paused, seeming to decide whether to share more classified information. Finally, he continued, the mission where she was wounded was supposed to be her last before taking a promotion to a staff position. She had already been selected for lieutenant commander and was being groomed for command of her own unit.
What happened? Rodriguez asked quietly. Sarah answered for herself. The extraction went wrong. The intelligence was faulty, and we walked into a trap.
The hostages were in much worse condition than we had been told, and the enemy force was 3 times larger than expected. I took a grenade blast that sent shrapnel through my face and neck, damaging my vocal cords and leaving me with some hearing loss in my left ear.
Morrison picked up the story. But, even wounded, she refused evacuation until all the hostages were secure.
She carried a 160-pound contractor for over a mile through enemy territory, taking fire the entire way. When we finally got her to the medical team, she had lost so much blood that the corpsmen weren't sure she would survive. The room was completely silent as the officers absorbed the magnitude of what they were hearing. This woman they had detained as a fraud was actually a legitimate American hero, someone who had risked everything for her country and her fellow Americans.
The injuries ended your career? Captain Martinez asked softly. Sarah nodded.
The hearing loss and nerve damage made me no longer suitable for operational duty. The Navy offered me a desk job, but after 12 years of active service, sitting behind a computer wasn't what I wanted to do. So I took the medical retirement and started consulting.
That's why you're here today? Rodriguez asked. Captain Reynolds asked me to consult on a new training program for special operations units.
Specifically, helping to develop scenarios that will better prepare teams for the kind of complex extractions that have become more common in recent years.
Admiral Morrison smiled with obvious pride. Even in retirement, Lieutenant Commander Chen continues to serve. Her expertise is in high demand throughout the special operations community.
She's helped develop training protocols that have already saved lives in the field. Sarah looked uncomfortable with the continued praise.
I do what I can to help.
The men and women going downrange today deserve the best training we can give them. And that, Morrison said, turning to face the other officers, is what a real Navy SEAL looks like.
Someone who continues to serve even after the uniform comes off, who puts the mission and the team before personal recognition, and who maintains operational security even when it would be easier to prove their credentials.
Captain Martinez felt the full weight of his mistake settling on his shoulders.
Ma'am, I don't know how to adequately apologize for what happened here today.
You were treated with disrespect when you deserved honor.
Sarah's response surprised everyone.
Captain, don't apologize for being suspicious. Apologize for not being thorough enough in your investigation before drawing conclusions. If you had simply called Captain Reynolds to verify my appointment, or run my name through the appropriate databases, this situation would have been resolved in minutes rather than hours.
Morrison nodded approvingly.
Even now, she's teaching. That's the mark of a true professional. As the immediate crisis passed, the officers began to grapple with the broader implications of what had happened. They had nearly charged a decorated veteran with federal crimes based on assumptions and incomplete information. The incident would require careful documentation and review to ensure that similar mistakes were avoided in the future.
Admiral, Rodriguez said hesitantly, what happens now? How do we handle the paperwork on this incident? Morrison's expression became serious again. What happens now is that you learn from this experience.
Lieutenant Commander Chen was gracious enough not to file a complaint about her treatment, but that doesn't mean this incident should be ignored. You need to develop better procedures for investigating suspected stolen valor cases. He turned to Sarah. And you, Lieutenant Commander, have a meeting with Captain Reynolds that you're now significantly late for.
Sarah checked her watch and grimaced. Actually, Admiral, I think Captain Reynolds might want to reschedule after he hears about this incident. Nonsense, Morrison said firmly. Reynolds specifically requested you for this training development project because you're the best person for the job. A minor administrative confusion isn't going to change that.
As Sarah prepared to finally leave the security office and continue to her original destination, Admiral Morrison pulled her aside for a private word.
Chen, he said quietly, how are you really doing?
The transition to civilian life can be challenging, especially after the kind of service you gave.
Sarah considered the question carefully. Some days are better than others, Admiral.
But I stay busy, and I feel like the work I'm doing still matters.
That helps. Morrison nodded, understanding. If you ever need anything, you know where to find me.
The Navy takes care of its own, even after retirement.
Thank you, sir. That means more than you know.
As Sarah finally walked away from the security checkpoint, the officers watched her go with a new understanding of who they had just encountered. The woman in civilian clothes walking across the base was someone who had served her country with exceptional distinction, who had shed her blood in defense of American lives, and who continued to serve even after her active duty had ended. Morrison turned to address the remaining officers one final time. Gentlemen, today you learned an important lesson about assumptions and the dangers of incomplete information. But you also had the privilege of meeting one of America's finest warriors. I suggest you remember both lessons. Captain Reynolds was pacing in his office when Sarah finally arrived, nearly 2 hours late for their scheduled meeting. He had received 3 different phone calls about an incident at the security checkpoint, each version of the story more confusing than the last. When Sarah knocked on his door, he was both relieved and curious to hear her side of what had happened. Come in, Sarah, he called, setting down his coffee cup and studying her face as she entered. He had worked with her before and knew her to be punctual and professional, so the delay was completely out of character. Captain, I apologize for the late arrival. I encountered some unexpected difficulties at the security checkpoint. Sarah's voice carried a slight hoarseness that hadn't been there before, a lingering effect from the vocal cord damage she had sustained years earlier. Reynolds gestured to a chair across from his desk. I heard there was some kind of confusion about your credentials. Admiral Morrison called and gave me a brief overview, but I'd like to hear what happened from you directly. Sarah settled into the chair and recounted the morning's events in the calm, precise manner that Reynolds remembered from their previous collaborations. She didn't embellish or dramatize the situation, simply stating the facts as they had unfolded. Her military training was evident in how she organized the information, presenting it as she would have given a mission briefing. So they detained you for stolen valor because of your tattoo? Reynolds asked, finding it hard to believe that trained military personnel could have made such a fundamental error in judgment. They were doing their job as they understood it, Sarah replied diplomatically. The problem is that there's no easy way to verify classified service records, especially for someone who's been medically retired. My DD-214 shows my time in service but doesn't detail the nature of my assignments for obvious security reasons. Reynolds nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation. He had dealt with classified personnel records before and knew how difficult it could be to verify someone's background when their service involved sensitive operations. The incident does highlight something we need to address in the training program we're developing, Sarah continued, smoothly transitioning back to the reason for her visit. One of the challenges our operators face is the potential for misunderstanding their credentials when they're working in civilian clothes or in situations where they can't reveal the full nature of their background. This was vintage Sarah Chen, Reynolds thought. Even when she had just been through an embarrassing and potentially damaging experience, she was already analyzing it for lessons that could benefit others. It was exactly this kind of professional mindset that made her so valuable as a consultant. "Tell me more about that," Reynolds said, genuinely interested in her perspective. Special operations personnel often work in environments where they can't openly identify themselves as military. They might be undercover, working with foreign nationals, or operating in politically sensitive areas where American military presence isn't officially acknowledged. When they return to normal military environments, they sometimes face skepticism about their credentials because their service records are classified. Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "What happened to me today is a mild version of something that could have serious operational consequences. If our people can't prove their credentials to other Americans, imagine the problems they might face when working with allied forces or in joint operations." Reynolds was taking notes now, recognizing the practical implications of what Sarah was describing. "So you're suggesting we include credential verification protocols in the training scenarios?" "Exactly. We need to train both our operators and our security personnel on how to handle situations where traditional identification methods aren't sufficient. There should be secure channels for verification that don't compromise operational security but still allow legitimate personnel to prove their credentials when necessary." The conversation continued for the next hour, with Sarah outlining her preliminary thoughts on the training program Captain Reynolds had asked her to develop. Her experience that morning had actually enhanced her understanding of the challenges the program needed to address, turning what could have been a negative incident into valuable professional insight. "Your reputation preceded you, but, I have to say, your actual expertise exceeds even what I had heard," Reynolds said as their formal meeting concluded. "Admiral Morrison mentioned that you've been working with other units on similar training programs." Sarah nodded. "I've consulted for several special operations commands over the past 3 years. Each unit faces slightly different challenges, but there are common themes. The nature of modern warfare requires our people to be more adaptable and versatile than ever before." "What's been the most significant change you've observed since you retired?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "The biggest change is the speed of operations. When I was active duty, we might spend weeks or months planning a mission. Now, our people are expected to plan and execute complex operations in a matter of hours or days. The training needs to reflect that reality." Reynolds was impressed by her analytical approach. "How do we balance the need for speed with the requirement for thoroughness?" "Scenario-based training," Sarah replied immediately. "We create realistic situations that require rapid decision-making under pressure, but we build in decision trees and protocols that ensure critical steps aren't skipped. The goal is to make the right choices instinctive rather than intellectual." As they wrapped up their initial planning session, Reynolds found himself curious about Sarah's personal journey. "If you don't mind me asking, how has the transition to civilian consulting been for you? It can't be easy going from active operations to training others." Sarah's expression became more reflective. "It's been an adjustment. There are days when I miss the immediacy and clarity of operational missions. When you're downrange, the objectives are usually clear and the team dynamics are straightforward. In the consulting world, everything is more complicated and political." "But you found it rewarding?" "I found it necessary," Sarah corrected gently. "The men and women who are doing the job now deserve the best training and preparation we can give them. If my experience can help them come home safely or complete their missions more effectively, then that's where I need to be." Reynolds noted the careful way she had phrased her response. Sarah wasn't consulting because she loved the work, but because she felt obligated to continue serving in whatever capacity she could. It was a mindset he recognized in many elite veterans, service as a calling rather than just a job. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Reynolds called for the visitor to enter, and Admiral Morrison stepped into the office. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Morrison said, though his tone suggested he would have entered regardless of the answer. "Not at all, Admiral," Reynolds replied, standing respectfully. "Lieutenant Commander Chen and I were just finishing our initial planning discussion." Morrison's attention focused on Sarah. "How are you feeling after this morning's excitement?" "I'm fine, Admiral. no lasting harm done, and possibly some valuable insights gained for the training program. Morrison smiled, recognizing her ability to find professional value in personal adversity.
That's the Chun I remember. Always turning challenges into opportunities. Admiral, Reynolds interjected, I have to say, having the chance to work with Lieutenant Commander Chen is an honor. Her approach to training development is exactly what we need. I'm not surprised, Morrison replied. Chen always was one of our most innovative thinkers. She had a talent for seeing problems from angles that others missed. Sarah looked uncomfortable with the continued praise. Admiral, Captain Reynolds, I appreciate the confidence, but the real test will be whether the training program we develop actually improves operational outcomes. Everything else is just conversation. Morrison laughed. Still focused on results over recognition. Some things never change.
As the meeting concluded, Morrison asked to speak with Sarah privately. After Captain Reynolds excused himself to attend another meeting, Morrison closed the door and turned to face Sarah with a more serious expression.
Chen, I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Are you really okay?
Not professionally, but personally. The incident this morning must have brought back some difficult memories. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering how much to reveal.
Admiral, there are days when the transition is harder than others. Being questioned about my service, having to prove my credentials, dealing with the skepticism that comes with being a woman in this field, it can be exhausting. Morrison nodded, understanding. And, today?
Today reminded me why the work matters.
Those security personnel weren't being malicious, they were trying to protect something they believed in.
The problem is that the system didn't give them the tools they needed to make an accurate assessment. But, it also must have been frustrating to be treated as a criminal when you've served with such distinction.
Sarah shrugged.
Frustration is a luxury I can't afford, Admiral.
Getting angry about misconceptions doesn't change them. Developing better training and procedures might.
Morrison studied her face, noting the way she deflected personal concerns in favor of professional solutions. It was a coping mechanism he recognized in many combat veterans, focusing on what could be fixed rather than dwelling on what had been damaged.
I want you to know that your service is not forgotten, Chen.
There are people at the highest levels of the military who remember exactly what you accomplished and the price you paid for it.
Thank you, sir. That means a lot.
And I want you to know that if you ever decide you want to return to active duty, there are ways to make that happen. Your injuries were significant, but there are positions where you could serve effectively despite the limitations.
Sarah was surprised by the offer.
Admiral, I appreciate that, but I'm not sure I'm ready to consider returning to active duty.
I'm not asking you to decide today. I'm just letting you know that the option exists if you ever want to explore it.
The military needs people with your experience and perspective, especially as we face new challenges in special operations. As Sarah left Captain Reynolds' office and walked back across the naval base, she reflected on the unexpected turns her day had taken. What had started as a routine consulting meeting had become a confrontation with her past, a reminder of both the respect she had earned and the skepticism she continued to face. The security checkpoint she had to pass through again on her way out was staffed by different personnel, but word had clearly spread about the morning's incident. The guards were professional but notably more respectful than they might have been otherwise. Sarah found herself wondering whether the change in treatment was an improvement or just another form of the same problem, making assumptions based on incomplete information.
As she drove away from the base, Sarah considered Admiral Morrison's offer of a return to active duty.
3 years ago, when she had first retired, the idea would have been impossible to contemplate. The physical limitations imposed by her injuries had seemed insurmountable, and the emotional toll of leaving her team behind had been devastating. But now, after 3 years of consulting and training work, she was beginning to see her experience differently. The challenges she faced as a veteran consultant had given her insights that could be valuable in ways she was only beginning to understand. The incident at the security checkpoint had been uncomfortable, but it had also demonstrated something important. There were problems in the system that needed to be addressed, and she was uniquely positioned to help solve them. The question was whether she was ready to take on that challenge in an official capacity once again. 3 weeks after the incident at the security checkpoint, Sarah found herself back at Naval Base San Diego, but this time the circumstances were entirely different. She was returning not as a consultant trying to prove her credentials, but as the newly appointed Director of Special Operations Training Integration, a position that Admiral Morrison had created specifically for her.
The decision to return to active duty had not been easy.
Sarah had spent countless hours weighing the advantages and disadvantages, discussing the opportunity with the few people who truly understood what she had been through. In the end, it was the memory of the confused and embarrassed faces of the security personnel who had detained her that tipped the scales. Captain Martinez was among the first to greet her as she arrived for her first day in the new position. The man who had ordered her detention 3 weeks earlier now stood at attention, saluting crisply as she approached wearing the uniform she hadn't worn in 3 years. "Lieutenant Commander Chen, welcome back to active duty," he said formally, though she could see the mixture of respect and lingering embarrassment in his eyes. "Thank you, Captain," Sarah replied, returning his salute.
"I understand you've implemented some new procedures for credential verification."
Martinez nodded, grateful for the opportunity to demonstrate that lessons had been learned.
"Yes, ma'am.
We've established a rapid verification protocol for personnel with classified service records, and we've instituted additional training for all security personnel on the challenges faced by special operations veterans."
Sarah was impressed by the thoroughness of the changes. "How has the reception been among your staff?" "Excellent, ma'am.
The incident with your detention has become a case study in the importance of thorough investigation before drawing conclusions. It's helped our people understand that service takes many forms and isn't always immediately obvious." As Sarah made her way to her new office, she reflected on the unexpected path that had brought her to this point. The position Admiral Morrison had created for her was unique in the military structure. She would oversee training development for all special operations units within the Naval Command, ensuring that programs were coordinated, effective, and based on current operational realities. Her first official meeting was with a group of training coordinators from various special operations units. As she entered the conference room, she was struck by the diversity of the assembled personnel: active duty operators, civilian contractors, former military instructors, and academic specialists. It was exactly the kind of comprehensive approach she believed was necessary to address modern training challenges. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, standing at the head of the conference table, "thank you all for being here. I know that some of you may have questions about my background or qualifications for this position, so let me address that directly." She paused, making eye contact with each person in the room. 3 weeks ago, I was detained at the security checkpoint of this very base because personnel couldn't verify my credentials as a Navy SEAL. That incident wasn't just an embarrassment, it was a perfect example of the systemic problems we're here to solve. Sarah could see surprise and recognition on several faces. Word of the incident had spread throughout the special operations community, but many of the details had been distorted through retelling. The truth is, we have created a military culture where many of our most experienced veterans can't easily prove their service record because of legitimate security classifications. At the same time, we face a real problem with individuals falsely claiming military credentials.
Our current systems often can't distinguish between the two.
A hand went up from Commander Sarah Williams, a training coordinator from the SEAL teams.
"Ma'am, how do we balance operational security requirements with the need for verification?"
"That's exactly the right question, Commander," Sarah replied.
"And it's one of the primary challenges we're going to address. We need secure, rapid verification systems that protect classified information while allowing legitimate personnel to prove their credentials when necessary."
Over the next 2 hours, Sarah outlined her vision for an integrated training system that would address not just tactical and operational skills, but also the administrative and bureaucratic challenges that special operations personnel faced. It was a comprehensive approach that drew on her experience both as an active operator and as a veteran trying to navigate civilian systems. "One thing I learned during my time as a consultant," Sarah explained, "is that many of the problems our operators face aren't solved by better weapons training or physical fitness. They're solved by better preparation for the complex environments they'll encounter, both during and after their service." Following the meeting, Admiral Morrison stopped by Sarah's new office. He found her reviewing personnel files and operational reports, already deep into the work of understanding the current state of training across all units. "How was your first official meeting?" he asked, settling into a chair across from her desk.
"Productive," Sarah replied.
"The team is enthusiastic, and they understand the scope of the challenges we're facing.
I think we can make some real improvements."
Morrison studied her face, looking for signs of how she was adjusting to being back in uniform.
Any regrets about coming back? Sarah considered the question. It's strange being back, Admiral.
3 years ago, I thought my military career was over permanently. I had accepted that and found ways to contribute from the outside.
Coming back feels like getting a second chance to finish something important. And the incident 3 weeks ago? How do you feel about that now? Honestly? I'm grateful it happened.
If I hadn't experienced that confusion and misunderstanding firsthand, I wouldn't have the same sense of urgency about fixing these problems. Sometimes you need to see the system from the perspective of someone who's been failed by it.
Morrison nodded approvingly. That's exactly why you're the right person for this job.
You understand both sides of the equation, what it's like to serve at the highest levels, and what it's like to be misunderstood and underestimated. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Sergeant Rodriguez entered, looking nervous but determined.
Lieutenant Commander Chen, I hope I'm not interrupting, he said formally. Not at all, Sergeant. What can I do for you? Rodriguez straightened his shoulders.
Ma'am, I wanted to personally apologize again for my role in the incident 3 weeks ago. I also wanted to let you know that the experience has changed how I approach my duties.
Sarah gestured for him to continue.
I've been working with the security training team to develop new protocols for situations where standard identification isn't sufficient. We're also implementing scenario-based training where personnel practice handling cases that might involve classified service records.
That sounds like excellent progress, Sergeant.
Ma'am, I was also wondering if you might be willing to speak to our security teams about your experience. Not just the incident 3 weeks ago, but your perspective on how we can better serve veterans who are transitioning to civilian roles or consulting positions.
Sarah was touched by the request. I'd be honored to do that, Sergeant. When would you like to schedule it? Would next Friday work for you, ma'am? Perfect. We'll make it happen.
After Rodriguez left, Admiral Morrison smiled at Sarah.
You see?
The impact you're going to have goes far beyond just training special operations personnel. You're helping the entire military community understand these issues better. As her first day in the new position drew to a close, Sarah walked back through the security checkpoint where her journey had begun 3 weeks earlier. This time, she was in uniform and carrying proper identification, but she was also carrying something more important, a deeper understanding of the challenges facing modern military personnel and a clear mission to address them. Petty Officer Martinez was back on duty, and he snapped to attention as Sarah approached.
Good evening, Lieutenant Commander, he said respectfully. Good evening, Petty Officer Martinez. How are the new procedures working out? Very well, ma'am. We've had 3 cases where the enhanced verification protocols allowed us to properly identify veterans with classified service records. No more unnecessary detentions. Sarah smiled. That's exactly what we want to hear.
As she walked to her car, Sarah reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this point. 3 weeks ago, she had been a frustrated consultant, detained and questioned about her right to wear the symbols of her service. Tonight, she was a uniformed officer again, with the opportunity to ensure that other veterans wouldn't face the same challenges. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Captain Reynolds. Congratulations on your first day back.
The training program we discussed is going to benefit from having you in an official capacity. Looking forward to working together again. Sarah typed back, thank you. This is exactly where I need to be.
Driving away from the base, Sarah thought about the tattoo on her arm that had started this entire series of events. The SEAL trident that had once been questioned as potentially fake was now accompanying her back to active duty, where she would use her experience to help others avoid the misunderstandings and challenges she had faced. The coordinates and dates tattooed beneath the trident told the story of her sacrifice and service, but they also represented something more. They were reminders that every veteran carried invisible badges of their service, experiences that couldn't be easily verified or understood by those who hadn't shared them. In her new position, Sarah would work to bridge that gap, creating systems and training that honored the service of all veterans while protecting the integrity of military credentials. It was a complex challenge, but it was also exactly the kind of mission she had always thrived on. 6 months later, the program Sarah developed had become a model for military installations across the country. The rapid verification protocols she designed were being implemented throughout the Department of Defense, and her training scenarios had become standard curriculum for security personnel. More importantly, the number of incidents involving veterans being falsely accused of stolen valor had dropped significantly, while the military's ability to identify actual cases of credential fraud had improved dramatically. Sarah's story had become something of a legend within the special operations community, not just because of her combat service, but because of her determination to turn a negative experience into positive change for others. The woman who had been detained for wearing a genuine SEAL trident had become one of the military's most effective advocates for veteran recognition and support. Standing in her office one evening, looking out at the base where her second career had begun with such unexpected circumstances, Sarah touched the tattoo on her arm and smiled. The symbols that had once been questioned were now helping her ensure that future generations of warriors would never have to face the same doubts about their service. The trident was genuine, and now everyone knew it, not just because an admiral had recognized the truth, but because Sarah had used her experience to create lasting change that would honor the service of all veterans who had earned the right to wear the symbols of their sacrifice.